Thank you for being here. I premise my paper by saying that the validity and dignity of gender nonconforming immigrants is not in question. This discussion will engage in critique of xenophobic, racist, and transphobic practices within U.S. institutions. In queer feminology, Sarah Ahmed states, quote, "We could even describe whiteness as a bad habit, as a series of actions that are repeated, forgotten, and that allow some bodies to take up space by restricting the mobility of others." End of quote. I extend Ahmed's argument to acknowledge that gender conformity in U.S. citizenship, like whiteness, could be described as bad habits. In this manner, transgender immigrants are systematically excluded from spaces such as this one. And bodies that are gender conforming or aesthetically gender conforming are included. In this way, we are implicated in the exclusion. Those of us who conform are implicated in the exclusion of those who do not. Within this context of a transgender immigrant woman, I could say that I am here because she's not. On July 20, 2007, Victoria Arellano, a 23-year-old woman, transgender woman, was detained by U.S. immigration officers. Although Victoria identified as female, the officers placed her in an all-male cell because Victoria was an immigrant who arrived in the U.S. as a child. Her immigration paperwork was well underway when she was detained. As a person living with HIV, she managed her health by taking medications. Once she was detained, the medications were denied. This denial of medications led to the decline of her health and ultimately to her death. The last time Victoria Arellano saw her daughter, she saw a fragile woman fighting for her life while shackled to a hospital bed. In the future of our world, Black feminism and the politics of knowledge at the university, Grace Hong aligns herself with the work of James Baldwin, who speaks about the importance of bringing out your dead. Hong states, quote, "To bring out your dead is to remember what must be forgotten, to find the evidence of things not seen. That the notion of American equality in the protection of life is a fallacy. That life is not protected if you're race and gender, and that you are race and gender if your life is not protected. To bring out your dead is to say that these deaths are not unimportant or forgotten or worse, coincidental. It is to say that these deaths are systemic." Victoria Arellano was a Mexican immigrant whose identity defied white heteropatriarchal notions of U.S. citizenship. She was a member of a community that struggles to survive various forms of structural violence and violations. Like many other Latina transgender women, Victoria was victimized because her body was read as one that challenged white heteropatriarchy. In speaking about Victoria, I am engaging in what Baldwin has called, quote, "naming your dead," as a sign of defiance against oppressive systems. Because transgender immigrants are often obscure or erased from various dominant institutions, it is nearly impossible to accurately document the injuries of deaths within this community. This paper seeks to address the evidence of things not seen by speaking of the possibilities that marches and demonstrations have on immigrant trans communities. In her essay, "Janitors for Justice, Latinizing Los Angeles, Mobilizing Latina Cultural Repertoire," Maria Gutierrez de Solatenko articulates the ways in which Latino organizers have been successful during the demonstrations because of their use of cultural repertoire during the marches. Solatenko writes, "Using cultural repertoire contests and constructs urban spaces in the struggle for recognition." End of quote. In this essay, I align myself with Solatenko's argument to state that during marches and demonstrations, Latina transgender immigrants made use of their gender, sexual, and cultural repertoires in order to enact resistance to oppressive immigration policies, transphobic public spaces, and structural violence at large. I also rely on the work of Judith Butler, notions of performativity, and Halberstam's concept of rage as a site for queer resistance. This essay is an attempt to situate political activism among transgender Latina immigrants, the intersection of immigration status, race, class, gender, and sexuality are evoked in order to better articulate transgender Latina activism and political engagement. To further contextualize the socio-political status of Latina transgender women in the U.S., I borrow the term structural violence. Structural violence was first coined by medical anthropologist Paul Farmer during the 1960s. According to Farmer, structural violence refers to, quote, "the embodiment of macro forces that result in the distinct patterns of social suffering." Currently, U.S. immigration law does not recognize transgender as a sexual category, and people who are detained or are in the process of seeking citizenship are gendered according to the sex they were assigned at birth. The inability to acknowledge genders beyond the male-female dichotomy situates gender nonconforming immigrants in a paradoxical situation where they are simultaneously non-existing in legal discourse, yet hyper-visible to immigration and police officers in public spaces. Thus, many transgender immigrants are denied proper employment documentation, and in this manner, sex work becomes one of the few employment opportunities for this population. As sex work often occurs within public spaces, transgender immigrants become highly visible and at risk of physical and emotional violence from lay people as well as government officials who operate under heteronormative laws. In this context, the street is a place where one's life is in danger while making a living. Within this context, structural violence is experienced from a transphobic society. Some Latina transgender immigrants in Los Angeles have found an organization called Bienestar that has provided a space for them to organize and participate in public immigrant-rights marches as a collective. Participating in the march as a collective constitutes a powerful political strategy where transgender women mobilize and are seen as members of a community and not as isolated, criminalized subjects. The need for transgender Latina immigrants to organize politically has been reinforced in a post-9/11 era in which immigrants' rights have progressively declined and abused. Raids, deportations, and refusal to grant human services to immigrants are among the many problems affecting immigrant communities. The perception of the immigrant as a material and symbolic threat to the nation has heightened in this era, where patriotism is conflated with heteropatriarchy, racism, xenophobia, ableism, homophobia, and transphobia. Thus, one can argue that post-11 marks an era where a history of imperialist oppression meets current anxieties about otherness. The crossroads of historical oppression and current fear of the other sets the stage where structural violence against immigrants is enacted by government officials and applauded by certain sectors of the American public. The Minutemen, an official anti-immigrant organization, has achieved much popularity and funding. Their success as an organization informs us about the popular anti-immigrant sentiment enacted by lay citizens and supported by major institutions who refuse to acknowledge their blatant racist and xenophobic threats. Given the circumstances that are faced on the streets, one wonders how the issue of violence against transgender Latina immigrants women may be taken into account within the walls of academia. I wonder if performance and queer theories are able to account for what is occurring in terms of violence, defiance, and activism. In Gender is Burning, the questions of appropriation and subversion, Butler asks questions that may help us discuss the ways in which we come to participate in the discussion of Latina transgender immigrants. Butler states, quote, interpellation is a unilateral act, as a power and force of the law to compel fear and that at the same time that it offers recognition. But it attains as well a certain order of social existence and being transferred from an outer region of indifferent or questionable or impossible to being in the discourse of social dominion of the subject. If interpellation of transgender Latina immigrants occurs unilaterally, offering recognition while simultaneously depriving them of power, what is our role in conceptualizing agency within transgender communities, within it and not outside from it? More importantly, what are the implications of failing to see the political agency and possibilities within this population? According to Butler, coming into discursive existence through injurious terms reaffirms marginality and vulnerability. Thus, one must be cautious not to perpetrate epistemic violence while formulating discussions about transgender Latina immigrants and political agency. Judith Halberstam's essay, Imagine Violence, Queer Violence, speaks of the possibilities that performing violence creates for feminists of color. Halberstam argues that an imagined violence, such as the one found in June Jordan's poetry, has the potential to have direct and material fear on those enacting hegemonic power. Marching in downtown Los Angeles while chanting, carrying banners, and wearing heels should not be a sign of threat. Yet, given the ways in which white heteropatriarchy informs immigration policy, these very acts have the power to subvert transphobia in U.S. institutions. The news media is unable to ignore the large masses of people taking the streets of major cities across the nation unaided. However, the visibility of queer immigrant activists remains minimal. Hate crimes, job discrimination, and other forms of structural violence affecting trans immigrants often drive passionate activists to fight for justice and political visibility and respectability. Working collectively and sometimes competitively with predominantly heteronormative immigrant spaces, trans immigrant activists are often overlooked and undermined in a movement that seeks to break oppressive laws about geographical boundaries. This paper has examined the socio-political space that transgender Latina immigrants occupy and how this space forms their understanding of political engagement and activism in Los Angeles. Through public marches, demonstrations, transgender immigrants forge a space of belonging where civic engagement has a myriad of meanings. Political demonstrations on the streets are a call for visibility for those the system calls illegal aliens. With the marches, the demonstrators enact a citizen-granted right to assemble in public, to question the government, and demand just treatment. Notions of interpolation and performativity as a side of political agency and resistance must be explored further in order to bridge gaps between activism in academia and U.S.-based political engagement with that of other first world nations, where immigrant rights are violated. With this in mind, I am searching for a transgender Chicana immigrant paradigm that allows for scholar activism that is complex and critical of the strengths and needs of trans immigrants in the U.S. and transnationally.